On October 30th, 1503, behind the holiest walls in Christianity, something unspeakable unfolded. A papal wedding became a display of fear, humiliation, and absolute power. What happened inside the Vatican that night was never meant to be seen, but it was never forgotten. If you want forgotten moments pulled out of history's darkest corners, share this video with others, not for this channel, but for the truth itself. And drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. To understand why October 30th, 1503 mattered, the world around it must come into focus. This was not a Vatican of quiet prayer or moral restraint. This was Renaissance Rome, crowded, corrupt, and ruled as much by fear as by faith. The church was not only a spiritual authority, it was a political empire. Gold flowed through its halls. Armies marched under its blessing. Lives were negotiated, traded, or destroyed behind closed doors. The Apostolic Palace stood at the center of it all. Its walls were covered in frescoes of saints and salvation, yet beneath those images, deals were struck that had nothing to do with God. Offices were sold. Loyalties were bought. Silence was enforced. The sacred and the profane lived side by side, separated only by ritual and pretense. At the heart of this system was the Borgia dynasty. Their rise had been swift, ruthless, and unapologetic. Pope Alexander VI ruled not as a shepherd of souls, but as a monarch. His authority was absolute. His word reshaped borders, ruined families, and elevated his own blood above every law the church claimed to uphold. Rome knew this. Europe knew this. And no one challenged it openly. Fear kept the machinery running. Cardinals obeyed because defiance meant exile, or worse. Noble families complied because refusal invited war. Even faith bent under the weight of survival. In this world, morality was flexible, and power was the only constant. By the autumn of 1503, tension hung thick in the Vatican air. Rumors moved faster than prayers. Servants whispered. Courtiers avoided eye contact. Something was being prepared, something hidden beneath ceremony and tradition. The bells would ring. The vows would be spoken. And behind the spectacle of holiness, a deeper truth waited to reveal itself. Because what was about to happen was not an accident. It was the natural outcome of a system that had forgotten its limits. And this night would expose it completely. Lucrezia was 21 and already twice widowed, her youth consumed by alliances she never chose. Europe spoke her name with suspicion, painting her as a poisoner, a seductress, a willing accomplice to her family's crimes. But inside the Vatican, she was something else entirely. A bargaining piece. A body moved across the board to secure power. Raised to obey, trained to smile, taught that duty outweighed desire. Her vulnerability was not weakness, it was proximity. She belonged to the men who ruled her life, and escape was never an option. Alexander ruled from the papal throne with the certainty of a man who believed limits were for others. Father and pope, monarch and judge, he blurred every boundary without hesitation. To him, the Vatican was not a sanctuary but a stage. Ceremony was a tool. Faith was leverage. And people, whether cardinals, kings, or his own children, were instruments of his will. His defining trait was entitlement, reinforced by decades of unchecked power. His vulnerability was invisibility. No one could stop him, and no one would dare try. Cesare did not need to speak often. His presence carried its own language. Trained for war, sharpened by betrayal, he was disciplined without mercy. Where his father commanded, Cesare ensured compliance. Cities fell at his approach. Families disappeared after his visits. He understood fear as a science. His role was execution, of threats, of resistance, of dignity. His vulnerability was obsession. Power was not enough. Control had to be absolute. Alfonso arrived in Rome as a prince and became a captive before the wedding bells rang. He knew the stories. Everyone did. He understood that marriage into the Borgia family was not an honor but a sentence. Yet refusal meant war. His defining trait was restraint, an attempt to preserve dignity inside a trap. His vulnerability was honor in a place that recognized none. He walked into the Vatican not as a guest, but as proof that even powerful houses could be broken. Burchard had seen Rome at its worst and learned to record without reaction. As master of ceremonies, his duty was order, protocol, memory. He stood close enough to power to observe it clearly, yet far enough to survive it. His defining trait was precision. His vulnerability was truth, because someone had to remember what others would deny. And when the night ended, his words would be all that remained. Each of them entered October 30th, 1503, carrying a role they did not fully control. By dawn, none of them would leave unchanged. The wedding was meant to symbolize unity between two powerful houses, the Borgias and the Este family of Ferrara. On paper, it was diplomacy sealed by marriage. In reality, it was a demonstration, a warning delivered behind incense and velvet. The Vatican that night was sealed tight. Guards controlled every entrance. The guest list was selective, loyal, obedient. What followed was not a celebration in the usual sense, but a carefully staged performance of dominance. Music played, wine flowed, rituals unfolded exactly as ordered, and every movement was watched. Lucrezia sat at the center of it all, dressed in splendor that felt more like armor than luxury. She smiled because she had been trained to smile. Alfonso stood beside her, acutely aware that this marriage was not about affection, but submission. He was surrounded by men who held his future and his life in their hands. According to accounts from the time, the atmosphere shifted as the evening progressed. Boundaries dissolved. Decorum eroded. What should have been private became deliberately public. Power was asserted not through violence alone, but through humiliation, through the removal of choice, dignity, and silence. This was the Borgia's language. Not chaos, but control disguised as ritual. Faith provided the setting. Authority provided the permission. And fear ensured compliance. No one intervened. No one objected. Because inside the Vatican, resistance did not exist, only survival. By the end of the night, the message was unmistakable. This marriage was not a union of equals. It was proof that the Borgias could reach into the most sacred space in Christendom and reshape it to their will. And what happened next would ensure that this night would echo far beyond October 30th, 1503. What made the events of that night truly enduring was not only what happened, but who saw it, and what they were forced to do afterward. High-ranking cardinals, bishops, ambassadors, and courtiers were present inside the Vatican apartments. These were not anonymous figures or distant servants. They were the men who shaped doctrine, advised kings, and spoke in the name of moral authority across Europe. And yet, on this night, they became witnesses trapped by fear. Some reportedly turned their faces away. Others remained frozen, saying nothing. A few, emboldened by wine or ambition, laughed along, mistaking survival for complicity. But none objected. None intervened. Silence became the price of continued life and position. The most important witness of all was Johannes Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies. His role was to observe, record, and preserve the official memory of papal events. He was no idealist. He had seen corruption before. But even he later suggested that this night crossed a line so severe that writing it down felt dangerous. And yet, he did write. Burchard's diary would become the single most significant reason this event did not vanish into rumor. His account was careful, restrained, almost clinical, perhaps because any hint of emotion could have been fatal. He understood that truth inside the Vatican did not protect you. It condemned you. The witnesses carried what they had seen like a wound. They could not speak openly. Confession meant exile, imprisonment, or death. So the truth survived in fragments. Whispers passed between diplomats, coded letters sent to foreign courts, and quiet warnings exchanged behind closed doors. Silence did not erase the event. It amplified it. Because when those entrusted with spiritual authority refused to act, history remembers the absence louder than any scream. And the cost of seeing, of knowing, was a lifetime of complicity that none of them could ever escape. The night ended, but the damage did not. The Vatican returned to ritual. Masses were held. Blessings were given. Yet beneath the marble floors, something irreversible had taken root. And the world beyond Rome would soon feel it. The Vatican tried to bury the night in silence, but Rome has never been good at keeping secrets. By morning, servants were already whispering. By nightfall, guards had begun drinking heavily in taverns, their words slipping loose with the wine. Within days, fragments of the truth leaked beyond the palace walls, distorted, incomplete, but unmistakably horrifying. At first, the story spread in hushed tones. People spoke without names, without details, lowering their voices as if the stones themselves might be listening. But fear only sharpened curiosity. What had happened inside the most sacred rooms of Christendom that left seasoned courtiers pale and shaken? Foreign ambassadors were among the first to understand the scale of what had occurred. Trained to read silence as carefully as speech, they noticed how cardinals avoided eye contact, how Vatican officials refused to discuss the wedding night, how guards were rotated and dismissed with unusual haste. Diplomatic letters began leaving Rome, written in code, dispatched under urgency. Courts in Venice, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire soon received reports that hinted at an unspeakable scandal at the very heart of the Church. The Venetian ambassador would later write that what he had learned surpassed even the excesses of ancient Rome. Others described the event as a humiliation so profound it could not be undone by prayer or penance. The Borgia name, already feared, became synonymous with moral decay. Among the common people, outrage mixed with grim validation. For years, many had suspected corruption at the top of the Church, but suspicion was one thing. Confirmation was another. Preachers began alluding to unnamed sins in high places. Satirical pamphlets circulated quietly. Artists embedded subtle mockery into their work. Even those who dared not speak openly now believed the worst rumors were true. Most damaging of all was how the story refused to die. The Vatican could punish individuals. It could suppress documents. It could threaten witnesses. But it could not silence an entire continent once the idea had taken hold. The night of October 30th, 1503 became more than a scandal. It became a symbol. Proof, to many, that absolute power inside the Church had rotted beyond repair. Decades later, reformers like Martin Luther would point to the Borgia era as evidence that Rome had lost its moral authority. The seeds of rebellion were already planted, watered by whispers that began on that single night. What happened inside the Vatican did not remain inside the Vatican. It traveled, through fear, through rumor, through truth spoken just loudly enough to survive. And once Europe listened, there was no turning back. When the night finally ended, no one emerged unchanged. But for two people in particular, survival itself became a sentence rather than a relief. Lucrezia Borgia left Rome shortly afterward, traveling to Ferrara with her new husband, Alfonso d'Este. To the outside world, it appeared to be a political success. A powerful alliance sealed, a duchess installed, order restored. But those who saw her closely noticed something had gone missing. The young woman once described as lively and warm now moved with restraint, her expressions carefully controlled, her voice rarely raised. It was as if part of her had been sealed away forever inside the Vatican walls. In Ferrara, Lucrezia tried to rebuild herself. She patronized artists and poets, supported hospitals and convents, and ruled her court with intelligence and discipline. Over time, she earned respect not through seduction or scandal, but through competence. Yet even as she crafted a public identity far removed from Rome's corruption, the shadow of that night never fully lifted. Contemporary accounts describe moments of deep melancholy, sudden silences, and a sadness that no success could erase. Alfonso d'Este carried his own scars. He returned to Ferrara outwardly intact, but inwardly broken. The ordeal had stripped him of more than dignity. It had shattered his belief in honor, faith, and protection under law. Those close to him later observed that he became distant, guarded, and unusually grim for a man of his rank. He never spoke publicly of what happened in Rome. Silence was his shield, and perhaps his only way to endure. Their marriage continued, and children were born, but it was never whole. The bond between them had been forged not in love or trust, but in shared trauma. They lived side by side, not together, two survivors bound by a night neither could forget and neither could ever name aloud. Meanwhile, the architects of the horror met very different ends. Pope Alexander VI died only months later, his sudden death feeding rumors of poison and divine retribution. Cesare Borgia, once the most feared man in Italy, lost his power almost overnight. Abandoned by allies, hunted by enemies, he died violently in exile, his body left mutilated, far from the grandeur he believed was his destiny. History did not absolve them, but neither did it fully heal their victims. Lucrezia died young, worn down by childbirth and a life spent enduring rather than living. On her deathbed, she reportedly asked for peace, not forgiveness. an ending that speaks volumes about a woman who had been condemned by reputation, controlled by power, and silenced by fear. The survivors lived on, but the night lived with them. And in that truth lies the cruelest legacy of October 30th, 1503, not just what was done, but what could never be undone. The events of October 30th, 1503 did not end when the candles burned out or the Vatican doors closed. The horror, humiliation, and manipulation carried consequences that rippled far beyond the walls of the Apostolic Palace. The story became legend, whispered in corridors, repeated in letters, and eventually codified in the memory of Europe itself. For centuries, the Borgia name became shorthand for corruption, moral decay, and the abuse of power. Their actions, especially that night, fueled suspicion of the Vatican across Christendom. Ambassadors, chroniclers, and diplomats passed the story down in fragments, each version colored by fear or moral outrage. By the time it reached the wider European consciousness, it had grown into a symbol of how absolute power could warp faith and crush innocence. The night also left a psychological scar on the church itself. Cardinals and clergy who had witnessed the events carried the weight of complicity. Their silence had cemented a precedent. Obedience to authority was more sacred than justice, survival more vital than morality. Even within the sacred hierarchy, whispers of shame persisted, reminding the powerful that the eyes of history could be merciless. The wider implications reached reformers and critics. Decades later, figures like Martin Luther and other Protestant leaders cited the excesses and corruption of the Borgia papacy as evidence that the church had strayed from righteousness. The events of that wedding night became a rhetorical weapon, a story to illustrate how absolute authority, when unchecked, could destroy not only individual lives but also the faith of entire nations. And yet, the night also revealed the resilience of human memory. Through diaries, letters, and cryptic records, Johannes Burchard ensured that history would not completely erase the horror. While the Vatican attempted to suppress the details, Europe remembered. The story endured, not because of sensationalism, but because it captured something deeper: the consequences of unrestrained ambition, the vulnerability of innocence, and the moral cost of silence. October 30th, 1503 is remembered not as a single act of cruelty, but as a cautionary mirror. It asks, what becomes of those who hold power without accountability? What becomes of those who survive but are forever marked by trauma? The answers are not simple. They are found in whispers, in diaries, and in the lives of those who carried the weight of a night that should never have happened. History did not forgive that night, and neither, in subtle ways, could those who lived it. October 30th, 1503 was more than a single night of horror. It was a lens through which the darkest impulses of power, faith, and human cruelty can be observed. Within the opulent walls of the Vatican, a family's ambition, a father's tyranny, and a brother's ruthless calculation converged to create a spectacle that stripped away dignity, agency, and innocence. The grandeur of the palace, the sacred frescoes, and the ritualistic veneer of ceremony could not hide the human cost: the broken bodies, shattered minds, and lives irreversibly scarred. Lucrezia and Alfonso became symbols, not of their own choices, but of what happens when individuals are caught in a system that values power above morality. Their survival was a hollow triumph, proof that endurance is not synonymous with justice. The night's events remind us that those in authority can manipulate not just people, but entire narratives, turning suffering into spectacle, obedience into complicity. Beyond the walls of Rome, the consequences were spiritual, political, and cultural. The story traveled through whispers, letters, and chronicles, shaping perceptions of the church and its hierarchy for generations. It fueled outrage, debate, and reform. Yet it also revealed a chilling truth. While history may condemn the perpetrators, it cannot erase the trauma endured by the innocent. The victims' voices were silenced, their suffering recorded only by others, filtered through fear and shame, leaving gaps that the human imagination struggles to fill. The night lingers because it is both extraordinary and painfully familiar. It is a story of absolute power unchecked, of cruelty masked as ceremony, and of silence that enabled abuse to thrive. It asks questions that remain relevant across centuries. How far will those in power go to assert control? How does trauma persist when the world refuses to witness it? And how does society reconcile reverence for institutions with the failings of those who lead them? Ultimately, October 30th, 1503 is a warning. It teaches that opulence and piety can conceal horror, that obedience can perpetuate injustice, and that human suffering often leaves traces far longer than the grandeur that caused it. And because we remember, because we bear witness to what was hidden, the echoes of that night are not lost. They serve as a reminder that the past, even in its most sacred spaces, can be both magnificent and monstrous. It is a lesson in vigilance, empathy, and the enduring need to tell the stories that others would rather forget. If you want more stories pulled from the shadows of history, voices erased by ambition, cruelty, or silence, consider subscribing.